Welcome to the first of the two lectures on interest groups. Interest groups are those groups formed to influence policy making. Some other terms used for these type of groups are lobbyists, special interests, or pressure groups. Common types of interest groups are economic and corporate groups, which about half of all lobbying offices in Washington, D.C. today are this type of interest group. And Google, for example, has an interest group like this. And then you have trade associations, which about a fourth of all lobbying offices are this type. American Medical Association would be an example of this. And then you have ideological groups, which exist to promote a particular ideology. The national right to life would be an example. The fourth most common group is what's called public interest or citizen groups. Sierra Club would be an example. It's a California-based interest group that promotes protection of environment in various ways. However, this public interest title or label should be considered carefully. In practice, we see that it's sometimes used in a misleading fashion. For example, there's a interest group by name Partnership to Protect Consumer Credit, which implies that it's a public interest group that exists to protect consumers' rights in some way. But when we dig deeper, we see that it's nothing but a credit card companies lobby that promote deregulations of their sector to benefit the credit card companies, but not the consumers. The last slide over here, are largely pulled together by the membership dues and donations of those individual citizens who voluntarily join these interest groups. So if that's the case, then what are the reasons for people to join an interest group? First and foremost, they get information benefits. So for example, I'm a political economist and I'm a member of the American Economic Association. So by becoming an association and a due-paying member, I gain access to economic data that I can't find otherwise. And I use that data in my own research and support my career that way. So this is would be an example of informational benefits that people get from joining an interest group. Another type of benefits is the material benefits. So here, American Association of Retired Persons would be an example, better known in the public as AARP. As you know, this is an organization that builds motels on the roadside, highway side, and they have insurance plans for good, high coverage insurance for low premiums, etc. And these are all the benefits that people get by becoming a member to this organization. And then you have the solidarity benefits. In some interest groups, people join because they like the idea of being a larger group that consists of like-minded individuals. So camaraderie that they get from these groups also is a benefit. So when we discuss interest groups, we have to discuss the role of money in politics. The interest groups is a very important topic, which is why we dedicate an entire week in discussing this institution. Because according to some observers, interest groups are at the core of the reason why our federal government is challenged most. And most of the problems this country faces require some sort of a government intervention in the form of regulations or new laws being created to allow or disallow certain practices to address those problems. But unfortunately, we don't see an effectively functioning government in addressing those issues often, and the reason is often argued to be the role played by money in politics, and interest groups are the main facilitators of this process. So when we discuss money in politics, we see that there are two types of organizations these monies are channeled into the political section. The so-called PACs, which stand for Political Action Committees, and Super PACs. And PACs are those political organizations that are legally allowed to collect and spend only limited sums of money, but they can use that money to support a candidate or a party directly. Whereas super PACs are those that are allowed to raise unlimited amounts of money, but only for indirectly supporting candidates or parties. That's why in election years, such as this one actually, currently we're in an election year 2020, there's a presidential election in November, as you would know, you see that a lot of TV commercials and on a particular candidate and with a disclaimer that where one candidate says that he or she stands behind that message by saying that the organization that created that advertisement positions itself as a PAC and therefore goes by the rights and responsibilities of being a PAC in the system. And those other advertisements that say that they are not affiliated with a particular candidate would be announcing that they are super PACs, and accordingly there's no limits to the amount of money they can spend on indirectly supporting a particular candidate. So what are the pros and cons of interest groups? First pro would be that they are democratic institutions because they allow the people to exercise not one but three of their rights given to them by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution: the right to free speech, the right to participate in politics, and the right to petition government. All of those rights are practicable thanks to the presence of interest groups. That's why our founding fathers, upon much discussions on interest groups, decided to allow them to exist as legal practices in our system. James Madison was one who wrote most extensively on this topic. In Federalist Papers, he called them factions, and he said that factions would be okay for our system and we should let them exist legally because if we do that, then there will be a competition among them, and more companies, more and more factions would be included in the system, competing with each other for the attention of policymakers. And this is a healthy thing because it disallows any particular faction or interest group to dominate policy making. This approach is called theory of pluralism, and those who favor interest groups argue that theory of pluralism is the reason why we should continue to have interest groups as legal institutions in this country. On the other side, the cons of interest groups, or negative aspects of them, is that they create unfair competition for most Americans. And this is simply because of the fact that wealthy citizens are able to collect much more money, and accordingly their interest groups would have access to a much larger sums of money, and accordingly they would dominate the legislature. So James Madison's theory of pluralism appears to be a little bit of a naive expectation here. In practice, what we see is that money rules, and whoever has more money, their interest group dominates the legislature, regardless of how many interest groups are nominally competing in the system. A second drawback would be some people argue that interest groups are nothing but legalized bribery. They offer monetary benefits to elected officials, and this is the textbook definition or the dictionary definition of corruption. The fact that these monies are distributed sometime down the road or some indirect fashion instead of just under the table cash handouts does not make him any less of a bribery. This position, last position, is generally accepted, especially in Europe, where most of the advanced democracies there simply ban interest groups to take part in their political systems. In this video here, this last point is explained. I suggest you check it out to get a sense of this critical view of interest groups. And in this last video of this lecture, there is a 60 minutes segment, which is the longest running investigative reporting show in American history, a very successful TV show. I suggest you follow to get a sense of what's functioning and malfunctioning in your country as an informed citizen. It's a very, very good show. And in this particular episode, they are discussing the way that interest groups influence policymaking in today's Washington, D.C. And there are five ways that interest groups or lobbyists channel money into political leaders and elected leaders, and all these ways are discussed in detail with great footage and interviews with various insiders in Washington, D.C. So I strongly recommend you check out this 60 minutes piece here. This wraps up our discussion on the first of the two lectures on interest groups.